Some hotel rooms carry stories so disturbing that they never leave your mind. Room 907 at the Grand Imperial Hotel in Chicago was one of them. It was the evening of January 7, 1937, when a young man walked through the revolving doors of the Grand Imperial. The lobby, with its polished marble floors and gold-trimmed chandeliers, gave little hint of the shadow that would soon stain its history. He signed the register with the name Edward Murray, though many believe that wasn't his real name. Murray appeared to be in his mid-20s. He was thin, with brown hair neatly parted and a noticeable scar just above his left ear. One of his ears seemed oddly shaped, as though from an old injury. He wore a dark overcoat, sharply pressed trousers, and polished shoes. But for all his neat appearance, he carried almost nothing with him. His luggage consisted only of a small case holding a comb, a brush, and a single tube of toothpaste. For a man booking into a downtown hotel in the middle of winter, it seemed strangely inadequate. The bellboy, who escorted Murray to room 907, later remarked that his guest seemed tense, as though every movement was measured. He spoke politely but without warmth, answering questions with clipped words. It was not rudeness exactly, it was something else, something colder, as if his thoughts were consumed by a worry he couldn't put into words. Inside the room, Murray gave the first of many unusual requests. He asked the bellboy not to lock the door when leaving, explaining that someone would soon be joining him. When the maid arrived later to tidy up, she noticed that the curtains were drawn tightly shut, and the only light came from a small lamp left glowing on the desk. The room felt more like a hiding place than a guest's retreat. The maid, Mary Collins, would later tell police that Murray seemed on edge, and that he often sat silently in the corner as she worked. It was like he wanted to disappear into the shadows, she said. When she finished her chores and moved to leave, he reminded her softly, "Don't lock the door." Later that afternoon, Mary returned with fresh towels. The room was still cloaked in darkness. Murray was lying fully clothed on the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. On the small writing desk lay a slip of paper, handwritten in uneven letters. It read, "Meet me at midnight. Don't be late." That note, simple as it was, would later haunt the investigation. Who had written it? Was it meant for Murray, or had he left it for someone else? At that moment, however, the staff saw little more than an eccentric guest. Hotels in Chicago often played host to businessmen, drifters, and travelers with their own secrets. But there was something different about this man in room 907. A quiet unease settled over those who entered his room, a sense that Murray was not simply staying there, he was waiting. And what he was waiting for would soon turn room 907 into one of the city's darkest mysteries. The next morning, January 8, 1937, made Mary Collins return to room 907 at her usual time. She expected the room to be empty, but when she reached the door she noticed something unusual. The lock had been fastened from the outside. That typically meant a guest had left and secured the room behind them. But when she opened the door with her passkey, Edward Murray was inside. He was sitting quietly in the chair near the desk, the curtains still drawn, the lamp still casting its weak glow. Mary hesitated, unsettled by the thought that someone else must have locked the door from the outside while Murray remained inside. It suggested that another person had been in the room. As she cleaned, the phone rang. Murray answered in a low voice. Mary overheard fragments of the conversation. "No, I told you already. I'm not hungry." "I said no. I'm not hungry." The tone was firm, almost agitated, as if he were refusing someone who was insisting too strongly. The name Victor was mentioned once, though quietly. Whether Victor was the person on the other end of the line, or the one who had locked the door, would never be certain. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Mary returned with fresh towels. This time, she didn't enter immediately. She heard voices inside, at least two men, speaking low but hurriedly. Gathering her courage, she knocked. "Who is it?" came a rough voice from inside. "The maid." "I have towels," she replied. "We don't need any," the voice barked back. But Mary knew the towels were gone. She had taken them all earlier. She walked away quickly, a chill running down her spine. That night, the hotel began to stir with complaints. Guests in nearby rooms reported hearing loud arguments. A woman in room 909 described hearing a man's voice and a woman's voice, shouting and cursing. Another guest on the same floor swore they heard furniture being knocked over. Yet others dismissed the noise as part of a party taking place higher up in the building. Still, the sense of unease spread. Room 907 seemed to be at the center of it all. By the following morning, January 9th, the hotel's switchboard operator noticed something odd. The phone in room 907 had been off the hook for a long time. Calls placed to the room went unanswered. Around 7 a.m., bellboy Thomas Reeves was sent to check. He knocked several times. For a moment, there was silence. Then a faint voice answered, "Come in. Turn on the light." But the door was locked, and no one came to open it. Assuming Murray had been drinking or was unwell, Reeves called through the door, "Just hang up the phone, sir." With no other options, he left. At 8:30 a.m., another bellboy, George Miller, went upstairs. Using the passkey, he opened the door slightly. The hallway light spilled into the room, but inside it was still dark. Murray was lying on the bed, unclothed, unmoving, but breathing. The phone stand had been knocked over. Believing the man was simply sick, Miller replaced the receiver and quietly left. At 10:30 a.m., the phone was again off the hook. This time, Thomas Reeves was told to return. He unlocked the door, and what he saw inside room 907 would change the story forever. At 10:30 a.m. on January 9, 1937, bellboy Thomas Reeves was once again instructed to check room 907. The operator had reported that the phone inside was still off the hook, and repeated calls went unanswered. Reeves had been to the room twice already in the past 24 hours. Each time, he had walked away uneasy, convinced that something inside wasn't right. This time, he carried the passkey in his hand, determined to see for himself. When he knocked, there was no reply. The hallway outside the door was silent, the patterned carpet muffling his footsteps, the dim wall lamps casting long, tired shadows. Reeves hesitated, then unlocked the door. The room inside was almost completely dark. Only a faint line of light slipped through the curtains, and the weak desk lamp flickered dimly. At first, he thought the guest was not inside at all. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw him. Edward Murray was on his knees, hunched near the door, leaning against the wall as though he had tried to crawl out. His arms were wrapped awkwardly around his body, and his head was bowed. For a moment Reeves thought the man was praying. But then he noticed the slow, shallow movements of his chest. The carpet beneath him was stained. The bed linens were disordered, the phone stand overturned once again. There were marks across the walls, faint but unmistakable signs that a violent struggle had taken place. And on the floor, near the window, lay several cigarette butts pressed into the carpet fibers. The bellboy later insisted that Murray had never once been seen smoking. The discovery of those cigarettes meant only one thing: someone else had been in that room. Reeves rushed forward and turned on the main light. The scene was worse than he had imagined. Murray's face was pale, his breathing ragged. He seemed only half conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. When Reeves bent closer, Murray tried to speak. His lips formed a few words, but they were too faint to catch. Panicked, Reeves bolted from the room and down the corridor, calling for help. Within minutes, the hotel manager and another employee were at his side. They, too, saw the condition of the guest in 907 and immediately called both the police and an ambulance. When officers arrived, they carefully examined the scene. They noted the telephone receiver dangling loosely by its cord, the disarray of the bed, the closed curtains, and the general sense that the entire room had been kept deliberately in darkness. They also collected the cigarette ends, placing them in an evidence envelope. To the officers, it was clear Edward Murray had not been alone. As paramedics lifted the young man onto a stretcher, one of the policemen leaned close and asked, "Who did this to you?" For a moment, Murray's eyes opened. His lips moved again, and this time the words came out, Weak but distinct, nobody. I fell. It was a statement that made no sense. His injuries told another story, one of violence, restraint, and terror. But it was the only explanation Murray would give. By the time the ambulance doors closed, the mystery of room 907 had become a police case, one that was about to grow stranger still. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department arrived at the Grand Imperial Hotel shortly after noon. The building, usually alive with the bustle of businessmen and travelers, had fallen into a nervous silence. Whispers spread quickly among the staff and guests. Something terrible had happened in room 907. Detective Frank Delaney, a veteran officer known for his attention to detail, was the first to examine the scene once Murray had been taken to the hospital. He stepped into the dim room, his shoes crunching lightly on shattered glass from the overturned lamp. The curtains were still drawn tight, the air heavy with the musty scent of smoke and sweat. The detective carefully walked the perimeter of the room. On the desk he saw the handwritten note, still lying where the maid had seen it earlier. "Meet me at midnight. Don't be late." The telephone receiver dangled by its cord, as if it had been ripped from the stand. Delaney crouched near the bed and noticed dark stains on the sheets and along the carpet. But what caught his attention most were the small details others might have missed. Near the radiator, scattered across the floor, were several cigarette butts, different brands, smoked down at varying lengths. Delaney frowned. According to the staff, Edward Murray had never once been seen smoking. These were someone else's. On the nightstand, he found faint impressions, as though someone had rested a hand there during a struggle. He dusted for prints, but what emerged was smudged and incomplete, impossible to identify. In his notes, Delaney described Murray's condition when discovered: severe trauma to the head, bruising around the neck consistent with strangulation, and wounds across the torso. Yet no weapon had been left behind. Suicide was ruled out almost immediately. Someone had attacked this man. The question was who and why. Later that day, Delaney visited Murray in the hospital. The young man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. For a moment, Delaney thought he might not last the night. Still, he leaned close and asked quietly, "Mr. Murray, can you tell me who was in that room with you?" The man stirred, opened his eyes briefly, and whispered the same puzzling words he had said before: "Nobody. I fell." Then he drifted back into silence. It was an answer that provided no clarity, only deeper confusion. Clearly, the injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. Someone else had been there, perhaps more than one person. Yet Murray refused, or was unable, to say more. By midnight, Edward Murray's condition had worsened. Despite the doctor's efforts, he slipped into unconsciousness and never woke again. He was pronounced dead in the early hours of January 10, 1937. Detective Delaney stood in the hospital corridor afterward, writing the final lines of his report. He had seen many violent cases in his career, but this one unsettled him more than most. "Room 907, he muttered quietly, "will not give up its secrets easily." By the morning of January 10, 1937, the news had spread quietly through the Grand Imperial Hotel. The young man from room 907, registered under the name Edward Murray, was dead. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Detective Delaney already feared. Murray had succumbed to his injuries. The official report listed severe head trauma, wounds across the chest, and signs of strangulation. Yet the words he had whispered before losing consciousness, "Nobody. I fell," hung in the detective's mind like a mocking riddle. Back at the hotel, reporters began gathering, drawn by whispers of a mysterious death in a downtown suite. The management tried to keep details quiet, but in Chicago, secrets traveled quickly. Within days, newspapers carried stories about the Grand Imperial mystery, noting the strange circumstances: a man with almost no belongings, no identification, and no clear history. Since Murray had provided only a false name and carried no personal documents, the authorities had no way to identify him. He was, for the moment, a John Doe. Plans were made to bury him in a pauper's grave outside the city. But before the funeral could take place, the case took another strange turn. On March 2, 1937, the local paper announced the burial arrangements. That same evening, the funeral home received a telephone call from a man who refused to give his name. His voice was low and deliberate. "You must not bury him in a pauper's field," the caller insisted. "Arrange a proper funeral. He deserves better. Funds will be provided." Before the director could ask further questions, the line went dead. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at the funeral home. Inside was cash, enough to cover the entire cost of a funeral service and a respectable coffin. The bills were carefully wrapped in newspaper. There was no return address. On March 5th, the Rock Floral Company received an order for 13 American Beauty roses to be delivered to Murray's funeral. The order included a card. Written in neat script were the words, "Love forever, Louise." No one came forward to claim responsibility for the flowers. Detective Delaney, frustrated by the lack of leads, followed up with the telephone operator at the funeral home. She confirmed that the mysterious caller had spoken of a family connection. He had mentioned that the deceased had been loved once, and by the wrong person. The implication was vague but chilling. Perhaps this was not a random act of violence, but the result of betrayal. Even more unsettling, the Chicago police switchboard received an anonymous call that same week. The voice on the other end was calm, almost rehearsed. "You're looking for the wrong man," it said. Then the line clicked off. To Delaney, the message was another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Who was Murray, really? Why did strangers step forward to pay for his burial, yet refuse to reveal his identity? And what connection did Louise have to him? The answers remained locked away, buried with the man who had once checked into room 907 and left it only in silence. For weeks after the funeral, Chicago newspapers followed the story of the man from room 907. Readers speculated endlessly about his identity, but no one stepped forward with certainty. Then, more than a year later, a breakthrough arrived, though it only deepened the mystery. In the summer of 1938, a woman from St. Louis read a feature article in a crime magazine that recounted the strange case. The photograph of the dead man caught her attention. She thought she recognized him and brought the article to a friend of the family, Mrs. Reed. When Mrs. Reed saw the picture, she collapsed in tears. She was certain the man was her son, Samuel Reed, who had left home 2 years earlier at the age of 19. The identification was eventually confirmed by childhood scars that matched those described on the body. The man who had registered as Edward Murray was in fact Samuel Reed, a teenager. The revelation shocked investigators. Why had Samuel lied about his name and age? What had drawn him from St. Louis to Chicago and into room 907 of the Grand Imperial Hotel? Mrs. Reed offered one more chilling detail. In the spring of 1937, months after her son's death, she had received 3 letters in the mail. They were signed with Samuel's name, but they were typed, and he had never learned to type. The tone of the letters was strange, filled with slang and phrases he had never used before. She had assumed at the time that he was simply growing up, trying to sound older. But after learning of his death, she realized the letters could not have come from him. Someone else had sent them, deliberately, to make her believe her son was alive. Detective Delaney reviewed the case again in light of this revelation. The false name, the anonymous funeral, the mysterious flowers signed Louise, and now the forged letters. It all suggested that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth about Samuel's life and death. But who? And why? The cigarettes in the room pointed to at least one other person. The voices heard by staff and guests confirmed that Murray, Samuel, had not been alone. And the anonymous calls and money suggested a connection to someone who cared enough to protect his reputation, but not enough to reveal the truth. In the end, no arrests were made. The trail of evidence led only to more questions, and eventually, the case files grew cold. Detective Delaney wrote the final words in his report: "The case of Samuel Reed, alias Edward Murray, remains unsolved." Room 907 at the Grand Imperial Hotel will forever stand as a reminder that some secrets refuse to be uncovered. Years later, journalists would occasionally revisit the case. One even reported receiving a plain envelope in the mail, containing nothing but newspaper clippings about the murder and a single handwritten note. Truth always costs more than life. And with that final, haunting message, the mystery of Room 907 slipped permanently into the shadows of Chicago's history, unresolved, unforgettable, and chilling to all who dared to remember it.